Fatih, are we online?
Okay. Welcome everybody to our fourth session today in the Second Civilizations Forum. Actually, this session is our second session in visuality and media topic.
I think you should wait, Nursem. Are you sure we are online on YouTube?
Yes, because he said that after. Yes.
Okay, hocam.
Okay, now?
Wait a second, please. I'm trying to check on YouTube.
Fatih Bey, can we begin?
Evet hocam, yayındayız.
Okay. Welcome again, everybody. Actually, this is our fourth session today in the Second Civilizations Forum, and especially the second session of the Visuality and Media. And we have very precious speakers today, and we will begin with actually Anna Peraica, and I want to introduce her a bit, and then I will give the floor to her. Anna is a visiting professor at Danube University in Krems, Austria for now. And she was most recently a visiting fellow also in the Central European University. Actually, her research interests are related with in transformation in the human knowledge and sciences, faced with changes of technology of photography mostly. And she has several writings and articles about it. One of them is, for example, the age of total images or culture of the selfie and victim symptoms. And she will be speaking about the topic of posthuman photography and index of species today. It's your turn, Anna. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this introduction. So I'm really happy that you invited me to participate in this event, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So my main field, basically, which I'm working, is post-digital photography. And the reason I have started researching in the problem of the index of species was that post-digital photography has arrived to the status of autonomously generating images from previously recorded photographic material. Which means that at this point, currently, we are facing first photographs which are not reflecting the reality. They are not indexing the reality, but they are being generated from little pieces of that reality in order to do another image, which is not a photography as we used to know it before. So the face we see is not a face that ever existed or that will ever exist. The problem of this type of photography at the same time is that it uses huge databases, archives, in order to compute. So one of these databases that has been used by this post-digital photography and generative photography is also the database of species that do not longer exist. So from one hand, databases of the species that are disappearing are growing. And from the other hand, the number of new forms generated from these images of this species grows in a digital space. So we are witnessing at the same time the disappearance of biological spaces in order to produce new digital elements that would become something as new species or something as new life forms, because they might also exist in a certain way. So when we speak about posthuman photography in the way that Daniel Rubinstein has defined it as a complete fragmentation, now we are reaching the point in which this indexical reality is completely dismissed in order to construct a completely new one. We can, of course, have two different standpoints at this moment and think as, for example, in a depressive kind of way, that the loss of species is going to be completely covered by the invention of new ones in digital space. But at the same time, we can also have kind of positive insight into capacity of photography to follow biogenetics. So, because before the photography, when it was invented in the 19th century, biologists have started using it in computing the original overlaying of negatives in order to see how some new genetic permutations might happen, photography might also have a capacity to compute phenotype in order to find missing elements of the genotype. So this is going to basically be the presentation in which I'm going to just show you to try to map the field or something I want to call photogenetics. And I want to call it photogenetics for the reason that it marks the field of computation between biological and visual technological field of photography. So this post-digital photography, how it overlaps with biological and how it enables us to compute not only the real biological material as in cloning, but also visual appearance of such a material we call in genetics phenotype. So in order to distinguish the genotype and phenotype, we also need to introduce a third type. It is a phototype we are going to be enabled to compute, and this phototype is not going to reflect anything existing because it's now being not representing anything that exists anymore. These new faces created are not being the faces that have ever existed and that will ever exist in a way that we know the existence and the ontology of photography as showing something that basically is existing. So I'm going to run my presentation and try to cover it less with my reading, but rather with my talk, because I have a feeling that I'm new things myself. So I hope you see my presentation. Is it visible for you? Yes, okay. So my first question was basically, how do images that are recording missing or species that are being on the edge of extinction work on us? We have met many of these images recently, images of species that are disappearing, images of species that are suffering because of human actions that have started in, according to Paul Crutzen, who defined the Anthropocene, have started with the invention of the steam engine. So the problem of these images, as Joanna Zielinska says, is that they're basically, and she is referring also to Susan Sontag, is they're basically situating us in place because we found ourselves not being at the place where these images do happen. And this type of reporting, as also Sontag told with war images, are only convincing us that we are basically being alive, contrary to species that are suffering. So probably we have never met polar bear in our lives. So polar bear is probably already a fictional figure for us. We know polar bears only through photographs, probably. And now seeing a polar bear suffering somewhere at a place we have never been, we have little capacity of connection to these new types of images representing suffering animals. At the same time, and this is JGAODA MIHANOVIC, she recorded a fox after a huge fire surrounding the city in which I live. So this small poor fox has found herself without her habitat, and she came to humans to ask for help. As the Anthropocene changes are introduced into environment, these are going to be images we are going to see much more and more frequently. So probably Anthropocene is at a certain point going to get out of the visual space of photography, because now we know it through photographs, and become more and more real and more. Why say it's actually related so much to photography? The Anthropocene, as defined by Paul Crutzen, was followed by the invention of photography only in 55 years. So 55 years after the invention of the steam engine by James Watt, we have the invention of a photographic process in 1939, which follows the changes introduced by humans. So we can also claim that at a certain point, humans have invented a witness to the damaging processes. That photography became a witness, a certain kind of to the complete extinction of species. And this was also the claim of Joanna Zielinska. She claimed that the capacity of photography today, recording from the outer space, might be that at a certain point, with the disappearance of all species, will record the disappearance of life in total. It might happen, that all this unmanned photographic equipment in space, like satellites and CCTVs on the ground, might record the disappearance of human. And we have seen that now in the COVID-19 situation. We have seen the cities erased of human life too. We have seen the cities, how they might look like without humans as well. So the capacity of photography to follow the extinction was also enhanced by the archives, and such archives have been formed from the 19th century. And by the landscape photography from the 19th century and landscape today, we know how the melting of glaciers happened. We would never know how the Antarctic looked like if there would be no photographs of the early missions on the Antarctic. So it means that our vision of the Anthropocene is tied to the photographic medium, that there is a little of the Anthropocene changes that we may see yet in our real environment. So for that reason, I have tried to formulate and coin a new concept called a photographocene, that is the epistemic relationship of humans to the Anthropocene through its images. So we know the Anthropocene through the images of its changes. We don't know it basically in real. We might know some of the effects and the consequences of it, which are still, for the most of living environments of human habitats, quite mild. So we might witness certain effects of global warming, but we don't see the damage which happens at the Antarctic, or the huge damage that happens in the oceans. They're still inaccessible to us. And because photography has a huge resolution and much larger than video, it is photography that becomes a dominant media that shows us what we have done, or humans as a race have done. So I would just like to show you briefly how it goes with there are basically two types of photographs I have been focused here. The first type of photography was the before and after photographs we use in order to compare the changes of the landscape, the changes of urbanization that happened, the technologization of the landscape, and of course the pollution of the landscape, which mark and describe the best the processes of the Anthropocene. But also we can refer to images of the index of species, and species that humans have recorded since the beginning of photography. So one of the inventors of photography, Talbot, I'm sorry, I'm having a problem. William Henry Fox Talbot was the one who first recorded species, basically plants, because plants were not moving and photography was still a slow in process. Already in 1844-49, so the photography was subject to the Academy of Science in France as an invention in 1939. So it took only 5 years when it started to record species systematically. Another author systematically recording species is Anna Atkins. Her cyanotypes, she was a close friend to Talbot, were of British foreign plants and ferns, made the second large archive. So the hope of these archives at the beginning was to index different kinds of alive material that exists in our surrounding. They have created a certain kind of database by nowadays existing, which can be related to an old biblical narrative of Noah's Ark. So in the Noah's Ark, which is told to happen in the biblical time, Noah gathers two specimens of each species in order to have a genetic material they can procreate after the huge apocalypse. So the thought behind the images of photographs of species was also to have a certain database that might also happen to procreate in a certain way, at least visual way, and in such a way that it might continue existing in our knowledge. So the thought and the belief behind photography was never to have merely the image. The photography continues life after the disappearance of life. So we keep photographs of our ancients and our precursors in order to have a feeling they are still alive, not to show that they are dead and on paper prints. So the thought and the belief behind photographs is alive. And in this way, plenty of authors continue, Woodward, Stephen Miller with X-rays, Catherine Wolkoff, Todd Forsgreen, and many artistic photographers continuing the photographic jobs of Talbot and Anna Atkins, of course, writing a history of biological photography in this area would be really a special endeavor. So what happened with such images is that at certain points, images of alive species, images that were in a way serving visual colonialization of space to bring us something that we might not be facing in our own habitats, and species that cannot be brought in our zoos and in our homes as domesticated, that these species suddenly started disappearing. So out of the assumed 9 million of species, we know 1.6 of them, and the rest of them is unknown, and they disappear at a huge rate at this moment. And we are being warned that by 250, many of these species are going to disappear in the process. Of course, if COVID-19 doesn't continue and save the world from ourselves. So there are few photographers that are completely dedicated to recording the last members of this species. One of them is Joel Sartori, who is building a geographic photo arc, and it refers to Noah from the Bible. This type of material, the visual material of the phenotype, will show some of the classes of ever existing genotype on the planet and the relationship we had to many of them. This is another author that produces images of the last species, is Tim Flach, the second one, which I have found very interesting. The images are contrary to Sartori's photograph. They are not studio records, but there are plenty of them recorded in the wild. The problem, of course, of the wildlife photography is the intervention in the original habitat of animals, and because of its popularity, the damage humans have made by recording these trophy hunt images is also large. But there are also photographs being produced by generative adversarial networks and different kinds of visualization of endangered and missing species. So Haku Hudo has made a campaign for the World Fund in Japan 2008, showing images that are being distorted in pixels in order to show how many of these species members are actually left on the planet. So regarding some of this, like for example, 1,600 species members of the bear have left in the area, and it's shown through the number of pixels of the image. So this type of visualization might also recall the relationship between genotype and phenotype. If we have a genotype of a certain kind of material, which shows itself in its phenotype, it visualizes itself in a phenotype. The relationship between phenotype and photography, and which I call phototype here, is also kind of weakly related, because now we are seeing something that at certain point might be recorded in genetical databases in its raw genetic material, but we will not know how its phenotypical organization in its original space looks alike. We will only have images and maybe genetic material saved in genetic databanks. The similar project was made by J.J. Smoot, also showing a number of pixels related to a number of species left. And I will now show you the official archives and databases being built by our world organizations. So one of the largest is Biodiversity Heritage Library. It contains images alongside information about the species. The life is a huge one, also being crowdsourced. Wildscreen Archive brings wildlife photography, also being focused on variety of life. Catalog of Life, which uses the structure of human sciences in order to bring species in taxonomically. And then Encyclopedia of Life, which is going to bring more and more of species, which are more in images as the species are basically vanishing. And one of the most sad is basically a list of threatened species we can follow, and we can follow information about damage humans have made to the life forms on Earth. But of course, and there is where I would like to hold this presentation and somehow conclude, is that with generative capacity of photography, with post-digital photography, we have entered to a completely new era in which we can compute images of, for example, in animals, you can compute images of your own home domestic animal, like pets, dogs and cats, and combine them with species that exist in or no longer existing. So we can try to see the possibility and impossibility of genotype and its computations, which are going beyond algorithmic computations. Human can basically know. We don't know the genetic computation as well as we can program deep learning and computers. But of course, at the same time, we can do something that is produce phenotypical variations, which we have maybe excluded from reality just because the whole system of Anthropocene was so damaging. Of course, that we could not by ourselves intervene in the 19th century as ourselves were not existing in the 19th century. And of course, that we are paying the damage of the unconscious process being brought by human race from the early 19th century, actually even before in 18th century, by the invention of the steam engine. But at the same time, technologies that we are developing might also be important, and we might also embrace capacities of computation that machines are introducing, and in somehow acknowledge new forms being generated by machines as forms that are coexisting with us and that are basically making and mirroring and helping us to understand the wildlife and the existence on the planet that we might not have a chance to meet. So at the same time, while we are not being able to see the effects of the Anthropocene, which are distant, and at the same time, while we are not being able to see the origins of the Anthropocene in the 19th century by our naked eyes, and that we have a photography as a tool to imagine it and to understand it, we also have a tool to understand how these changes are overtaking the planet and the capacity to understand the weight, scope, and size of Anthropocene itself. And I believe that this is basically the standpoint by which we should be generating our new knowledge on post-human photography. In that terms, this fragmented post-human photography is a new chance of photography to interpret, a new chance of photographic medium to show us something that is not halted by the ideology of interpretation that humans have actually been imprisoning the whole medium in for the last nearly 200 years. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Anna. We were a while turning off our cameras because of the connection, actually. I mean, I'm sorry if you feel a bit alone in between, but we were here and listening to you, actually. Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. And as I said, I also have a chance to read your paper, and I'm interested in so much, especially about the construction of subjectivity issue and the speciality issue. And actually, I think the existence and the truth relationship is very interesting you are presenting here. And I mean, maybe it is my sociological interpretation, but I am also getting a kind of new resistance, because actually as a sociologist and anthropologist, I am keen to negatively interpret this digital kind of transformation sometimes. But you are also pointing a kind of new resistance, or critically looking at the Anthropocene and a kind of how the humans are doing to the world and the new species. That's why I was a bit excited about this political kind of a point you are doing, actually. This is maybe my interpretation, and we can discuss more.
I'm sorry, it's my dog. He sings on the church bells, and it's going to be quickly. But this is what we are doing too.
Yes. I don't know he or she, but very cute actually.
It's he, but he likes to sing, and it's a church bells.
Okay, it's nice. I think we can get the questions at the end of the presentations. That's why I will go to the Simone now, and then we'll do discussion at the end of it. Simone Natale is an associate professor at the University of Turin, and especially he's also the principal investigator of the a project, Circuits of Practice project at Loughborough University in UK. And actually he has a very recent book from Oxford University Press, Deceitful Media, Artificial Intelligence and Social Life After the Turing Test. And he also has a different book called Supernational Entertainments, Victorian Spiritualism and the Rise of Modern Media Culture. And he will be speaking today about this book, and the presentation title is Deceitful Media, Artificial Intelligence and Social Life After the Turing Test. And we are, floor is yours, Simone, and we are very excited to listen to you. Please.
Thank you very much, Nursem, and thank you also to Ebarov Oja for inviting me today and to the Second Civilization Forum. I'm really excited and very happy to be here today. So I'll share my screen. All right, so in the last few weeks, a Twitter account attracted special interest in the press and in the public. This was the Twitter account of NASA's Mars rover Perseverance, that is part of NASA mission, a robotic automatic device that is built to explore parts of the Mars, the planet's surface. One thing that is interesting about this account is that the account speaks in first person, as if it was the Perseverance Mars rover that actually posted these updates. Although, of course, it is actually the NASA public relations office that does it. So this thing, the fact that this account posted in first person, as if it was the rover itself that communicates to the public, attracted some criticism. Some said, this is a deceptive approach because it suggests a humanity that isn't there in this robot. So today I want to pick up on this discussion about the distinction between authenticity and deception in AI. But what I'd like to suggest, what I suggest in my book, is that we should take a different approach to address this issue, the relationship between authenticity and deception in AI. Deception is not, in fact, in AI an exceptional circumstance, but instead is an integral part of what artificial intelligence is and how it works. It is as central to AIs as the circuits, software, and data that makes it run. And in this sense, the point is not much to understand if deception is involved in AI, but what are the outcomes and what is the potential impact or deceptive mechanisms that are activated by different AI technologies. So I'll explain what I mean in this presentation. I draw from part of my book, Deceitful Media, that came out just recently with Oxford University Press. In this book, I develop a historical trajectory from the beginning of AI to the very present, to technologies such as voice assistants. And I argue that the development of AI always built on knowledge about how users respond to machines exhibiting intelligence. I propose the concept of banal deception as a notion to understand these dynamics. But to start, we should start before even before the emergence of computing and before the emergence of digital media. In fact, modern contemporary AI are also media, because they enter in communication with users and in interaction with the user. And every interaction also presupposes a relationship of communication. So to understand AI, we also have to understand it in the context of different media and also of media history. In this sense, it can be useful to start by looking at the relationship between media and deception. Deception has been always a central component of media technology, of how media works. And with this statement, I don't want to suggest that media have the safety powers, or that we are all part of a conspiracy organized by the media to deceive us. No, what I want to suggest is that media are always built to adapt to our senses and intellect. And this also entails the emergence of mundane, normalized forms of deception by which physiological and psychological characteristics of humans, so of users and of audiences, are exploited to achieve specific aesthetic or functional effects. And I'll make some examples to show what this means. But so I call these kind of mundane, normalized forms of deception that are characterize mediation. I call them banal deception. And with this term, I want to stress that while deception is often used as a negative term linked to malicious intent and also as something that is exceptional, deception can actually also be something that is normalized, it is part of our everyday life and experience. And in this sense, can be useful also to remind that actually scientists and scholars in cognitive sciences, but also in philosophy and in other areas, have pointed out that deception is not something that contrasts, that is opposed to normal perception, but instead it is ingrained and inseparable from perception. For instance, Hoffman, in a very nice book that came out recently called "The Case Against Reality," argued that evolution has shaped human perceptions in a way that it is liable. The humans are liable to deception, and this very deception help us navigate the external world. So he calls them useful illusions. For instance, let's say that I am in the wood. I see something on my right that looks like an animal. So that I turn my head and I notice that it's just a bush with a strange form. Yeah, but the same situation in another, the same deception that led me to see the bush there would have helped me to see a potential danger in another occasion. So that's an example of how perception is actually ingrained in our way to navigate reality. So with this understanding of deception, I define banalization as a normalization of deception in media technologies, and I argue that all modern media, since at least the 19th century, employ to some extent deception to achieve some effects. And I can make, for instance, an example of cinema. The invention of cinema was the result, in fact, of decades of study about the functioning of perception. One of the first works, the significant work of film theory, Hugo Musselberg, the photoplay, a psychological study that came out in 1916, actually explored how cinema exploited different fallacies of human perception to achieve its aesthetic effect. And of course, you know, there is an element of illusion, of deception in cinema. But when we go to the cinematic spectacle, this element of deception, rather than having a malicious effect, is also something that makes it possible to enjoy the cinematic spectacle, and that's why also it has some kind of value to the user. Another example we can make is sound media. Also, sound recording, like cinema, emerged from studies about human physiology and psychology, especially for studying about human hearing. There are very nice, very important books by Jonathan Stern that explore this. And later on, format of analog sound reproduction and also later also digital audio files was calibrated to the ears of human listeners. For instance, MP3 compact make files, music files, audio files more compact by taking only the frequencies that are most commonly here understood by human users, taking out everything else. So that the sound medium is adapted to our ears, basically. And this sometimes took in the history of sound reproduction very literal so manifestation. For instance, this device invented in the 19th century by Alexander Graham Bell, the phonoautograph, actually incorporated part of human body, such as an excised ear and part of a skull of a dead man, to reproduce graphically sound. So actually a part of our anatomy was incorporated into the medium itself. I distinguish several characteristics, identify several important characteristics of banal deception. One of these characteristics is this everyday and ordinary character. The fact that banal deception disappears in the everyday and the mundane. The second is the functionality. I made example of cinema having a value. So the fact that we can enjoy the cinematic spectacle and participate in the events that happen, participate emotionally in the events that happen in the cinematic screen, thanks to this deception that acts in the cinematic media. So banal deception can have some potential value to the user, in contrast with malicious uses of strong deception, of other kinds of deception. Then there is obliviousness. Banalization is usually not understood as such by users or audiences, but is instead taken for granted and unquestioned. And finally, very important is programmability. Banalization can be anticipated by designers and developers and programmed to work as part of how a medium, but also an AI technology works. And in this sense, let's move now to the case of AI. And let's look at some little parts of the history of AI to see how this mechanism of banal deception is relevant to understand how AI works. We can take as a point of departure one of the initial parts of the history of AI, the Turing test, which was proposed as early as 1950s, or the very origins of computing and AI, by Alan Turing. Alan Turing started this paper where he proposed the Turing test with the question, can machines think? But immediately dismissed this very question, because they said basically that it is useless to ask such a question because we couldn't find an agreement on what thinking means. So he wouldn't be able to answer this question. So he proposed a substitution to this question, can machine think? And the substitution is the Turing test, where one interrogator, here C, enters in conversation with different agents through a teleprinter. So today will be in a chat room. And the interrogator doesn't know if he or she is talking to a machine or to a human, and has to find out just by talking with this in written form with this interlocutor. And if the computer is able to convince in a statistically relevant way that it is actually a human, then this computer program will pass the Turing test. Now, often the Turing test is discussed as a threshold to assess AI, but actually, if we look more closely at the Turing test, we see that here we see that the role of deception is so important. The computer passes to reset, in fact, if it can deceive a human interrogator into believing it is human. And this has a very interesting implication, maybe more interesting implication than if we look at Turing test as a threshold to assess if we have reached or not what we call AI. The implication, in fact, is that artificial intelligence cannot be defined in absolute ways, but can only be defined in relational ways because it has always to do with our perception of our technology. A perception that can be manipulated through deceptive practices. It is the judge who decides if this is AI or not. So if it's a human that actually decides what is when AI is there. There are, however, also in consideration with this issue of deception, there are also some significant limitation in this in the way the test tackles this issue. One significant limitation is that the test poses the question as a binary choice. Users, the judge in this case, have to decide if it is a human or a computer. This situation actually doesn't reflect our most common everyday interaction with AI. We are usually not asked to decide that. Yeah. So this is something that actually suggests that something different happens in our everyday conversation. But this doesn't mean that the deception is not very important to everyday interaction. And to see that, we can move to looking at some practical examples about AI technologies were developed. And let's take one of the earliest example, a pioneering program programmed by the German-born computer scientist at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Joseph Weizenbaum, who in the 1960s developed the first chatbot in history. Chatbot is a program that is able to make a conversation, a written conversation, like in a chat with a user. And Weizenbaum called this chatbot ELIZA. At the time, so it was quite an early time for programming. So the technology also in terms of computer power and also of software were limited. But Weizenbaum understood something very interesting about how conversation happens and how people do conversation, and used this intuition to program ELIZA in a way that it could be, in some cases, also relatively convincing. He understood that when we talk with someone, we attribute an identity, a role in the conversation, and this attribution of an identity of a role can impact on the credibility that we have for this interlocutor. So he designed ELIZA so that he could take the role of a psychotherapist, and because a psychotherapist is someone that can make a conversation without adding much to that conversation. For instance, if the user mentioned his or her mother, then the ELIZA would ask, "Tell me more about your mother." You know, something that is very easy to program, but that in this context of a conversation between a psychotherapist and a patient can still make sense. And we see, in the case of ELIZA, how AI mobilized this kind of banalization. There is a famous anecdote about how ELIZA was used. It's an anecdote that Weizenbaum himself tells in a book where he says that his secretary once was using ELIZA, so was talking with ELIZA, and he asked Weizenbaum to leave the room because she wanted to say something personal to ELIZA. Yeah, and this struck Weizenbaum because this secretary knew very well how ELIZA worked. He knew very well that it wasn't a person, and yet she wanted to say something personal to ELIZA. And scholars have discussed this, and for instance, Sherry Tarkle pointed out that ELIZA was fascinating, not only because it was lifelike, but because it made people aware of their own desires to breathe life into a machine. So in a way, so people wanted to see ELIZA as a potential social partner, and often, for instance, Tarkle noticed that people were avoiding questions that could show that ELIZA was just a chatbot and not a very sophisticated one, in order to make the interaction work. So So this is a good example of how something like banal deception can act. And let's move now to the last part of the presentation and to how Alexa and Siri and contemporary voice assistants take up these dynamics. So voice assistants such as Apple Siri or Amazon's Alexa or Google Assistant have become more and more common today. We can see how voice assistants mobilize so banal deception. In this, there is evidence of this also in much research that has been conducted about how users interact with voice assistants. In fact, for instance, Andrea Guzman has shown in her research that users understand perfectly well that assistants are just software. They don't fall in a deception such as the Turing test deception, where they believe that it is human and not a machine. But even if they do understand that assistants are just machines, they still apply social frameworks and meanings to relate with them. For instance, they might say good night to Alexa, even if they know very well that Alexa will sleep very well, even if they don't do that. And examples of how banal deception is taken up in voice assistants include the use of humanized voices. Companies could have choices, for instance, should have chosen for voice assistant to have synthetic sounding voices, like computer sound that didn't sound as human. They chose humanized voice because this could help users to familiarize more easily to this technology, to find this as more familiar, more closer. Yeah? So this was already an example of how elements of the user's perception was incorporated into the technology. Another example is gender. So voice assistants have been given clear gender, and there are also there's also evidence that choices that these companies took in terms of gender related to their understanding based on their own studies or their own information that they gathered about how users would react to different gender. For instance, with the idea that they might find a female voice more less threatening than a male voice. So also in this case, so how people was perceived was incorporated into. Another example is name. The very name that is given to these devices also encourages this play of assigning an identity. And also in the use of language, the fact that, for instance, the irony is used and there are elements of characterization. The different voice assistants are different now, for instance, in their use of irony. Siri uses much more irony, and this probably relates to the fact that the identity as a company of Apple that always have this identity based on the idea of creativity and so being special. So in the company so communication. So the use of irony also is something that actually is perceived as an evidence of intelligence by users. Although actually it's interesting to know that the use of irony is often the less sophisticated part of the technology because it is usually scripted. They have teams of creative writers that actually script jokes that respond to users' queries. So it is the less sophisticated part of the technology, but it is perceived by humans, by users, as something that is evidence of high intelligence and skill from this technology. So in conclusion, with banal deception, I describe mundane, everyday situation in which technologies and devices mobilize specific elements of users' perception and psychology, such as, for instance, the all-too-human tendency to attribute agency to project personality to voices. It is important to know that banal deception is usually not perceived as deception, but this doesn't mean that it can be very, very consequential. consequential. For instance, choices about how a voice sounds to humans can be very consequential in how people use this technology, and also, for instance, in reiterating and reproducing stereotypes and representation of gender, for instance. Why is this important? Well, first, banalization employs the same mechanism that can be used for also form of more malicious deception that they call strong deception. Just to make an example, if voice assistants are used or will be used in the future for marketing or even political propaganda, then the same mechanism of empathy that, for instance, can be stimulated by these tools can be mobilized to convince potentially voters to vote for a candidate. And of course, now this doesn't seem something that is an application of voice assistant, but let's think that just a few years ago, when we talked about social media, we didn't consider social media as something that could bring a potential threat also to democratic elections and to the public discourse. While now there are a lot of worries about that. So it's important to consider this element. And the second is that interaction with AI and robots and mobilize the dynamics of banalization will change how people understand and perceive humans. As we are more and more led to interact socially with these technologies, we change our way to look at technologies, and this can already be seen a lot in children and youth that interact with this technology. But even, for instance, an important scholar such as Peraica, she conducted studies across several decades, and she noted that people at the beginning of the 80s were the participants of her study tended to be very hesitant about the possibility to use chatbots for psychotherapy, for instance, while 20 years later, they were much more accepting of that. They said, well, if this can be helpful for the patient, why not? So Peraica has shown with her research across a significant number of years that our way to look and to consider what is acceptable and what not changes across time. And for this reason, it is important to develop an informed, skeptical stance towards AI that not only understand how AI works at a technological level, but also understand how we work and how we are liable to deception, how we can, our tendency to project personality and society into things can actually impact on how we use this technology and on the impact of this technology themselves. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Simone, for this wonderful discussion. Actually, again, I am just having so many questions and discussions in my mind, actually. Especially, maybe we will begin the questions, but I want to do some comments on especially the issue of you are showing the reciprocal relationship with artificial intelligence and the practices and experiences of human beings. Actually, this is very important because we are always taking this technology sometimes as a let's say intervention to our life, and we are not understanding that how we are involving this changes actually in a different way. And this is mostly about our perception, because there are some examples coming to my mind from my students as well. For example, how they are explaining that how they are feeling much more comfortable in gaming, or let's say, for example, in digital spaces than the social, real, I will call, maybe it is open to discussion, but real spaces. And they were also speaking about the fact that they can speak much more comfortable, much more freely, even for the gender discussions. They can use any gender they want. And they can say anything, and they can be animals, for example, and they are thinking it is freedom. I think the perception itself through this a virtual space and using the let's say artificial intelligence as a partner or as a, let's say, interlocutor in front of you is very interesting and transforming the social life itself. After this tons of questions in my mind, I will not ask now, but I am opening the floor to the other excited maybe audience. Heba Hocam, please.
Yes, it's just 2 points. The first one related to Simone's presentation. The first one is how we get used to generally dealing with machines and the shifts that are taking place in generations. So I'm an older generation, so we used to put machines in their place. You know, we know that we are using them, but there is a human life. You know, so we deal with the machine as if we are using machines. You know, the usage, the term of usage, etc. But now the machines are like partners in a way. So I saw recently this ad about a robotic dog that you can buy for your children, you know, and they were saying, you know, like it goes itself when it feels that the battery is going almost you know, off. To the battery station, so it knows where to find its battery station. You can tap on it so it can sit or sleep, and it's like how the coming generations. It's a very developed sort of small dog robotic, yani, so for the children. So how in the course of time, this sense of the price that you have to pay for social relation or even human interaction with other species, you know, with other, looking after plants, for example. I mean, the same with creating, I mean, this is a new invention that you have plastic plants, you know, you don't have to look after them, you don't have to water them, you know, and it's like a whole world. I mean, what you presented is part of it, but it's like a whole world where we don't have to pay the price of human interaction. And how this is going to, there is a great price that we will have to pay for this. You know, humans don't interact anymore. They're not willing to sacrifice for each other anymore. They prefer, as Nursem mentioned, you know, to deal with machines and to make their choices and then to turn off and to block whoever is giving them headache, etc. How this will affect our understanding of society. The other thing what reminded when you were talking about deception, I think that the dimension of deception is also there in surveillance. You know, from a political perspective, I'm a political scientist. Nursem is a sociologist. So we know that that our mobiles that we are watched. You know, we know we are watched. We know we are tracked. But we have to ignore it. And this is something that in liquid surveillance, Zygmunt Bauman has an interesting book called many books under the title of Liquidity. But liquid surveillance, he said, we know that we are surveyed, but we want to ignore it. We know that they are, we know that sometimes our mics might be recording for us some things that we are saying, you know, all these tricks. When you don't do the right settings, you might be, you know, trapped into so many tricks. Getting into your device, etc., and collecting data and recording, etc. But you ignore it because it's like, how else can I survive with my machines, etc. So it's very interesting what you're saying, how it reflects itself from the logic, the internal logic of it, in many other aspects of our social life. I wanted to comment to Anna, also from a political perspective, were these records, Anna, in any way, can they be used to hold some governments and some actors on the international level responsible for crimes? Can we consider these to be like genocides? You know, is there a liability? Is there an accountability that these records can be used against some policies that resulted in doing so? Because at least from a perspective of Islam, for example, from an Islamic perspective, this is a crime, you know, because we are also Islam is in a way, religions usually somehow anthropocentric, because we are responsible for such creatures in a way, and this is criminal. I mean, you shouldn't be doing this. Can we use these records in a way to make sure that this will not happen again? I don't know whether they have been used in a way, in a political or legal way.
Well, I would just jump in and answer. the thing about the missing, disappearing species is not even the responsibility of the current governments, but it goes really deep into history. It's related to things and deeds commissioned by our ancestors. So it goes to the 19th century, actually the late 18th century till today. The problem of the rising awareness in nowadays might be assisting us to find new models of preservation. But unfortunately, we are in a really large mechanism in which we are going definitely to lose plenty of species. So there is no way back there. The only possibility for us is to invent new paths, new ways of thinking by which we can save what can be saved. And the sixth extinction, we have to admit it is ongoing, and that most of the species we met on the planet are going to be extinct. The problem is only if the human race is going to be extinct before. There is a huge, if we are speaking now about this relationship to religions, there is a really huge dispute of the order of disappearance. So humans are thought that they are going to disappear the last, and they are going to witness own deeds. But the possibility that humans disappear much earlier in this chain of events is also very big. And now with the COVID crisis, we see that we are so vulnerable in relationship to the nature, and our own conviction as a race, as a species, that we are super powerful is somehow melting with the COVID-19 crisis. But really, Donna Haraway had a really good remark in certain articles. She wrote that amazingly enough, if humans disappear, only dogs are going to notice that humans have disappeared because they are depending on us. And other species might also feel relief, and most of them are never going to notice humans are ever there. So that is we have to change the paradigm of our own existence in relationship to other species, and somehow seek for the scenarios and technological options by which we can assist the preservation, or at least do the self-destruction so consequently that we allow the space for other species, which we have not been doing. Because we killed species not by the decision, but by the neglect. The neglect was killing.
I think you were also mentioning the epistemological part of it, and I think we need an epistemological paradigm shift here, actually, and like putting all the time human beings on the center through different political or ideological tools. Okay, I have to go to the questions because we have some questions. The first one is from Nagihan Hoca. Yes, please, Simone.
I'll answer Eba's question.
Okay, sorry.
No worry. I didn't want to leave the Eba's question unanswered. So yeah, there are two very good, very important questions, and I think that it's hard to know what will be the outcome, and I think that sometimes it's difficult to understand if there is really a distance. Sometimes, with my students, as we discuss these topics, I learn from them also, and in a way, often they are resistant to seeing this lack of interaction and so. But I think you are very right on the fact that it's very important to consider how these changes that are that are maybe small, hidden, that are not the more immediate changes, but can be very, very consequential for our societies and also for our political spaces. And in the second question also is very important, and the surveillance can be a very good example of that, because the banality of our choices when we decide to grant permission to an app. So it's something that works this way. Like users forget the consequences of these choices, and they just so take these choices without considering them as important during their life. And in a sense, there is this banality. And often, what is banal, what is everyday, what is mundane, is much more important of the things that are more seen. And in this sense, I think this can be a good example of how mechanisms of banal deception are activated.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for the questions.
Thank you very much, Simone. And yes, I am taking the Nagihan Hoca's question to Anna, actually. She was asking how your work might be related to NFTs. Yes.
Non-fungible tokens. So
Yes,
it might be related because the chain created is not following the simplistic visual logics of a flat algorithmization, but it goes beyond it, and it goes into generative, more fuzzy and chaotic logics working behind. But also there is a difference because with non-fungible tokens, we are speaking about pragmatic reasons, and we are speaking about the structure of the society in terms of its economical consolidation and structure. So what I'm speaking about is more how to go beyond the limits that are being positioned by any kind of institutionalization of even technology, photography as technology, but also institutionalization of the discourse on species, because now we are currently undergoing the problem that the national governments are not facing the crisis, the environmental crisis, seriously enough, because they are not seeing the consequences in their own territory. So that is the reason that this type of institutional barriers have to be broken down. And I think that's the point of departure of differences, that this type of computation, we must hope that it's going to bring us better knowledge of ourselves and the species, but also cross the barriers of the border.
Mm-hmm. Okay, then we have a question for Simone from Ayaz, actually. He's one of the PhD students in Alliance of Civilizations Institute. He is underlining the point that you are giving the relational and subjective level of the artificial intelligence, but he is also asking, as the technology still mobilizes our liability to deception, what are the ways in which we can be more critical and sophisticated users? This is the question. We cannot hear you. Can you? You are.
Sorry.
Yes. Okay.
Sorry. I have to do it at least once every time that I do Skype or Zoom.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Ayaz, for the question. Well, yeah, I think that you got an important issue here, and well, there are different ways in which we can develop this attention towards the subjective and relational interaction as a way to become more critical and sophisticated users. And the first thing is that very often when we talk about AI, we discuss outcomes that are related to big shifts, like the moment when AI will reach consciousness, or the moment when AI will surpass human intelligence. And regardless if this will be reached at some point, actually, so the consequences of AI are very strong in things that maybe but might be less evident, but are very consequential. And I think it is very important also to not only talk about AI in terms of what the technology achieves, but also in terms of how we as humans add to this and how we react to this technology. And it is actually possible. For instance, in my book, I do it with the case of voice assistants and with other examples. It is possible to consider and to actually track how companies, developers actually anticipated potential reaction and incorporated these reactions into the machine. So we can develop a critical approach to these practices that sometimes they might be actually just ways to improve the interaction. For instance, also even in the case of voice assistants, certainly the fact that it is a humanized voice, even a gendered voice, maybe might allow us more easily to integrate these tools into our domestic and everyday environment and experience. However, they might also have problematic outcomes. Again, the example of gender comes to mind, or the example of how this empathy is used, for instance, for marketing or political. So we have to consider what are the outcomes of these banal deceptive mechanisms that are programmed into artificial intelligence.
Okay, thank you very much, Simone. I think I can also very quickly ask two questions. One is for Simone and one is for Anna from Said Mustafa Ali. Actually, to Anna, he's asking what extent might it be the case that the human tendency to anthropomorphize is being intentionally manipulated to affect the conditioning dependency on the digital? This is the question.
Yeah, it's a really great question. Thank you very much. So the problem is that basically we are feeding the system in these generative networks with data sets. First of all, there's a problem of the database which has been used in generative algorithms. The data set is conditioned by the anthropocentric opinion because databases and archives built along humanist sciences from the 18th, 19th century and onwards. So we don't have another type of science that might be really established in order to focus on something that is non-anthropocentric. So they're all related to human paradigms of the Enlightenment and the processes of rationalization. So that's first of all, that we are using databases that are being filtered by our own opinions about the planet and they are being deceptive for themselves. And the second of all is that while training the sets, humans are training the sets. So we are still being present, we are the programmers inside the whole system in such a way that even when these generators and these two machines that are competing in order to produce something new, we are still having over a large intervention inside the system to say that it's possible to have non-anthropocentric programming at all. So even though that these machines are working autonomously and they are making images which are not being made by or for humans, they are still being conditioned by the whole system that is being defined. First of all, that is defining machine as a slave to humans. And second of all, that is defining a species in relationship to humans as well. So it's impossible basically to jump out of the system. It is deeply anthropocentric in a way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much, Anna. And actually, Simone already pointed a bit, but again, Said Mustafa Ali was asking about the political and economic implications. Yani who owns, who controls, who produce this kind of like applications. Do you want to comment on it?
Yeah, well, just shortly.
Maybe Simone, if I can add to this one because it will be related to this. It's when it comes to the banal deception, it is something good, so it can be used. But when it goes to reach to a strong deception, is there some kind of code that will govern the banal deception so that it can be prevented from moving from the banal to the strong deception and its misuse? Mostly in very politically strong cases where people would use this in order to defame people or frame people and others, their voices and things, and then they will be putting the Photoshop things around. And at the end of the day, it will be a political liability for certain individuals. So is there some kind of code of ethics that may govern the banal deception that will stop and prevent it from misused or abused? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mustafa Abuddin, for these questions. And yeah, it's they all point to the issue of political economy of AI. And I would say that we might answer in two ways. On the one side, we might consider the implication of banal deception itself. And already banal deception can have significant and sometimes also troubling implications at a political economy level. For instance, if you think about so again, I'll use the example that we already discussed, voice assistants. A tool such as Alexa builds a player representation that hides behind it the infrastructure of Amazon and the infrastructure also of labor, also in terms of inequality of many other issues with Amazon that are in a way hidden behind the interface. We might order things through Alexa, but we don't see so the implication of what our things, and projecting personality, sociality onto the tool might make this forgiveness, forgetfulness more, even stronger. Another interesting case is the fact that actually voice assistants give access to the web. They are interfaces to access the web, but the web that voice assistant give access to is not the web that we usually navigate with our browsers. It is basically the proprietary cloud of Amazon. It's something that Amazon can control. Voice assistants usually give just one answer to searches through voice assistants, and this so means that the company can have a stronger control on the user experience in this case. And the second aspect is how Wabuddin rightly asked about how can we control when this will become strong reception. There aren't so strong ethical codes of ethics of conduct, but I think it's very important to develop that. And in a way, I think that one other thing is that understanding how banal deception works can help us to understand much better about malicious and strong uses of deception, because they are basically the same mechanisms that can be mobilized. To make just one other example, deep videos, so deep fakes video are videos that are created by AI programs that simulate speech made by some people. For instance, we can have like an important, let's say Biden, the president of the United States, saying something that he never said, because the machine is able to program so that the voice and in the face of the president of the United States is seen as if it would pronounce these voices. Now, the strong deception that can emerge with these deepfakes is based on elements that are ingrained in the banal deception of film, of photography, in the projection of authenticity that we are often stimulated to assign to photographic images and to videos. This is what makes deepfakes so convincing to users. So if we understand how actually deception works in the everyday, in the mundane, the banal, we can understand how deception works when it is actually so potentially malicious and so dangerous when it is, so to say, strong deception.
Thank you very much, Simone. I think we already exceed our time, but it was a very nice and excited kind of discussion. I want to continue as well, but I think we don't have time more. Thank you very much to all of you, especially my speakers. It was an honor and pleasure for me. And maybe I can conclude with a pessimistic and optimistic point, because we were always talking about the digitalization with this danger Simone was also talking about and Vahdettin Hoca was pointing. But I think both Anna and Simone refer at the same time the agency, that there is still a hope of agency, that we can have our positions and interact and like structure different kind of political and social positions, or religious, or I don't know, value-based kind of positions against or not necessarily against, like as a danger, but producing them as a much more like useful ways. That's why I have still the hopes, and I want to conclude maybe with a much more optimistic level of it. Thank you very much, and inshallah we will see each other. Okay.
The following session starts in 6 minutes.